Hi class. Today I'm going to talk about incorporating sources into your papers. We'll look at summary, paraphrase, quote, citation, and quote sandwiches. Let's start by looking at the 3 ways we can use content from another source. We have quote, paraphrase, and summary. Let's look at each one individually. When you quote something, it is a word for word, copy and pasted piece straight from the original. You need to use your quotation marks to indicate where that quote begins and where it ends. If you use Control C and Control V, put those quotation marks around it and you've got yourself a quote. Paraphrase is a simplified in your own words version of the original text. Paraphrases simplify just a small section of the original text, like a sentence or a paragraph. With summary, it's a simplified in your own words version of the entire text. So paraphrases look at just a part, and summaries look at the whole. One thing that all 3 of these have in common is that you do need to name the author whenever you do it. So a lot of times we think of just saying so-and-so said blah, blah, blah in their quote, but we also need to do that when we paraphrase and summarize sources as well. I wanted to introduce a strategy from a book called They Say, I Say by Graf, Birkenstein, and Durst. And it's something that I really like. It's the quote sandwich. This is a strategy in which you make sure that you're incorporating all of your quotes and paraphrases and summaries in a way that is fair to the author. You begin by introducing the author and the title. Then you add your quote. And then you follow that quote up with an explanation or comment on the quote. And I love a good quote sandwich, so make sure you use a lot of them. So what these look like is really similar to something you already know, which is the tag that goes along with dialogue. The top piece of bread, it's just like what we've already been doing all along when we do dialogue. So an example, here's a tag when we're introducing a quote. According to Elise Barker, instructor of English at Idaho State University, comma, and that's similar to what we have. So it looks a lot like our dialogue. Chris said, comma, hey, did you fill that paperwork out yet? Quote, Linda Berry explains, comma, the 2 questions find everybody. Here's a whole bunch of example tags. You'll notice that there's a lot of variety here. In academic writing, we frequently use the present tense. So instead of saying wrote, explained, or said, we will put it into present tense and say, Linda Berry writes, explains, and says. Another thing to do is to mention the source text in your tag the first time you introduce the source, especially if it seems like it's relevant to what you're talking about. You also might want to use that tag to indicate why the author is worth listening to. So especially if you're writing about cartoonists, mentioning that Linda Berry is a cartoonist would be helpful. Another context, it might be better to mention that she's an art educator. So those are all some strategies. You can also use tags to transition between 2 sources. So for an example, Berry agrees with Lamott when she says blah, blah, blah. The second piece of bread in the quote sandwich is the quote itself. So in this situation, I've written, quote sandwiches are delectable. Again, when you format your quotes, it's a lot like dialogue. You have your tag capitalized with a comma, then the quotation mark, the quote, and the quote begins with a capital letter. and then you have a period followed by the end quote. So if you look at these, all of these sample tags are formatted in this same way, where we have the comma following the opening tag, a capital letter at the beginning of the quote, and a period inside the quotation marks. Sometimes in dialogue, we would use an end tag where the tag comes after the quote. It's not as common in academic writing, but you do see it in newspapers and blogs and online writing. So an end tag would look something like, quote, comma, Barry explains. So here we go. This is we're building up a quote sandwich here. We have, according to Elise Barker, English instructor at Idaho State University, comma, quote sandwiches are delectable. That red 13 at the end indicates a parenthetical citation and a page number potentially. I don't really have a source, but that's what it's for. So what are these parenthetical citations? Parenthetical refers to the parentheses surrounding the citation information. These parenthetical citations come after a quote or a paraphrase to show on what page you found the quoted information. They may also contain the author's last name. So in MLA, a parenthetical citation would look like last name, page number, both within the parentheses followed by a period. If you've already named your author, you just need to include the page number so it looks like this, according to Elise Barker, blah, 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 with our parenthetical number at the end followed by a period. Parenthetical citations look different in different styles. In MLA style, it's the last name, a page number, Chicago, last name, date, comma, page number, and APA, it's last name, comma, date. So just if you weren't confused enough already. The last piece of bread is explanation. In this case, I wrote, it is important to have delectable content because research papers should be enjoyable for the reader. If you look at it as we've built it into a full sentence, you can see each piece in those different colors. Something to keep in mind is that explanation is a lot like the reflective portion of your narrative papers. They may also be compared to thought shots because they represent your voice. They also may be related to telling rather than showing. What I like to do is to have a mix and match in terms of how I go about setting these things up. I mix and match paraphrases and quotes. I mix and match in-text versus parenthetical citations depending on what I need. So just to read this whole example, according to Elise Barker, English University at Idaho State University, quote sandwiches are delectable. It is important to have delectable content because research papers should be enjoyable for the reader. Quote sandwiches make papers easier to read, which makes them more enjoyable to read. Notice I end with a parenthetical citation there. The first time you introduce that source again, be sure that you include their full name, the credentials, and the source title in the tag if you can. After that, you can start referring to them using parenthetical citations. In most non-academic writing contexts, if you have a tag that names the author, you really don't need to have a parenthetical citation or an endnote. But regardless of what you're using, you should always name the author, regardless of whether you're paraphrasing, quoting, or summarizing. And again, also try to name the page number too, if it's possible. Another thing to note about how we set up our in-text citations is to think about them in terms of hyperlinks that move between the text of our writing and the works cited page. So the B in Barry's last name tells us where to look for the source on the works cited page. You need to make sure that there is the information in your text that will send us to the correct source in your works cited. All right, so the next piece of what we want to do is take all of the characters that we've learned about and learned from when we do our sources and get them talking to each other. That's the ideal way to set up research. So we have William Zinsser talking about how you shouldn't write for a teacher or editor, but write for yourself. William Zinsser, who says there's no such thing as writer blocks for writers whose standards are low enough. Anne Lamott's shitty first drafts, and Linda Berry's 2 questions. So let's look at some examples of how to do this. In her graphic novel, What It Is, Linda Berry explains the 2 questions find everybody. She argues, without the 2 questions, so much is possible. One thing to note is that if we go in there and add the page numbers, the period moves from being inside the quotation to being outside the parentheses. I don't know why it does that. It just does. Here's another piece. Anne Lamott explains in Bird by Bird, comma, quote, almost all good efforts or all writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. And now, okay, we've got a couple of examples. Now we need to get them going to talking to each other, just like we do with dialogue. So, in her graphic novel, What It Is, Linda Berry explains the 2 questions find everybody. She argues, without the 2 questions, so much is possible. Similarly, Anne Lamott also argues that it isn't useful to dwell on perfection, especially early in the drafting process. And Bird by Bird, Anne Lamott explains, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. And now let's keep going. But how do I chase away the 2 questions and embrace my shitty first drafts? I like to follow the advice of poet William Stafford, who says there's no such thing as writer's block for writers whose standards are low enough. When I remember Stafford's words, I think of my writer friends who aren't hugely talented, yet still manage to write and sell books. If they can do it, so can I. If you look at this, it's set up like a classic quote sandwich with a transition from the previous idea into the next author. Let's look at one more. Another thing that helps me chase away those paralyzing 2 questions is William Zinsser's advice in his book on writing well, in which he argues, if you consciously write for a teacher or an editor, you'll end up not writing for anybody. If you write for yourself, you'll reach the people you want to write for. It never fails me. I stop worrying about whether someone else will like my writing, and suddenly the words start flowing. I can revise with an audience in mind later, but I need to fill some pages first. And just look at that beautiful quote sandwich. They're so delicious. I hope that you continue to master the art of crafting that perfect quote sandwich. Just a reminder in terms of citation, if you're still struggling, take a look at this video that I have posted online, or use a citation generator. And in the meantime, happy quote sandwiching. I'll see y'all later.